Good evening, everybody. Michaela Young here. I'd like to share with you this evening a brief, somewhat high-level overview of irrigation infrastructure in Montana and some of the environmental and socioeconomic impacts and a few solutions. It's relatively high level, and it would be quite easy to go into greater detail about many of the topics mentioned in this presentation, but I hope you find this useful. So in terms of the environmental and socioeconomic problems, to begin with more specifically, a report by the Montana Department of Natural Resources or in partnership with an independent economic consulting firm revealed that Montana's irrigation infrastructure, including its dams, or typically people think of irrigation infrastructure as the dams and canals and various channels, that these were in less than optimal condition. And as it is, when they are actually in good condition, they have a number of environmental and socioeconomic issues attached to them. So just a brief history of irrigation infrastructure in the state, modification of the American water course, particularly in the West, began to take off in the New Deal era when settlers who came to this area were in need of predictable sources of water to water their re relatively arid settlements. And also, especially during the 1920s through 1930s, there was a lot of economic hardship and people out of work, especially with farming being as dismal as it was. The Roosevelt administration worked with Montana agencies, and from the New Deal era all the way through 1960, there have been nearly 181 projects constructed or rehabilitated. But when you look at, there's some pretty good mapping that's out there. It shows actually close to 800 structures of varying size. Again, this includes dams, canals, so we can take a look at what this looks like on the map. You can see these large red circles are dams that are over 100 feet high, so they're the larger projects. And well, these are the public dams, so dams that are managed by the federal government or state government, and the green are privately owned dams, and that could be corporate or civilian. And so you can see this map showing varying sizes, but you can see it's quite extensive and pervasive in the state. So some acknowledged environmental issues that come with water infrastructure, and these are fairly well established, are that to begin with, dams, when they are implemented, they disturb the natural flow and discharge patterns of a water course, meaning that you can see in the top chart where the water flow in stages is relatively stable, and then when you get spring runoff, April through July, it peaks, and then it drops back down to relatively low flows when summer's toward its end, and then begins to peak again. But so then you look at the bottom hydrograph, and you can see how the discharge patterns are really erratic and unnatural, and they're not at all like the natural flow and discharge pattern. So that creates a number of disturbances to the species that depend on those ecosystems, including fish and trees and shrubs and all kinds of things. So a few other issues that are, again, well acknowledged with infrastructure are the loss of aquatic and terrestrial habitat and declines in native species. And I have an image here of a cottonwood tree, which they tend to seed along the course of a river Usually if you see a big canopy, big extended canopy of cottonwood trees, you know there's a river there. They're sort of dependent on one another, but you see these types of species have issues and go into decline when there are disruptions to the flow and flow of the channels and things like that. So some social issues that have come along with implementation of water infrastructure are, to begin, displacement of human communities. A good example of that is, it's a pretty big recent example, the Three Gorges Dam in China, where millions of farming communities that had been established for a long amount of time were incentivized, I guess if you can use the word, by the government to move into cities, and they left behind their historical and cultural belongings, including their farms and a number of other, burial grounds and things like that. And many of them weren't properly compensated. So typically, between the footprint of the dam itself and the reservoir that will be in place, a large number of human and animal communities are typically displaced. So, and then you have unjust distribution of water resources. So whoever usually builds the dam gets to say where the water goes and doesn't go. And so there are often, many times, communities who are then deprived of that water resource, where before they might have had that resource or had access to that resource. And the longer those relationships are established with that resource, it's much more difficult to undo them. Again, okay, so we've got cost of restoring the dams that we mentioned in the beginning. That's a relatively pivotal issue here, where a lot of these dams are coming to the end of their natural life cycle. They're not reliable, they're not safe, they're not doing their job, and it's the state of Montana has been given a $131 million bill with not really a good idea of who's going to be covering that. Probably the taxpayer, and they're looking to the federal government for help as well. So here's the fun part, some solutions. Right now, the government is looking into, or has been pushed to provide funding for some remediation projects for the existing dams. And even some dams have been tapped to be made even higher because of drought. But in any case, the Department of Energy, Army Corps of Engineers, and the Environmental Protection Agency have been tapped to provide funding for these remediation projects, so that money would come from the federal level. Some more interesting and innovative solutions are the natural green infrastructure projects to deal with, because the drought issue still persists. It's the arid West, and that's not really going to change anytime soon. So some innovative folks have thought up ways to establish or reestablish wetlands and beaver dams to store water in times of drought. And there are foundations and organizations by the likes of like American Rivers and their partners who are actually going about removing dams. And there's been some examples, primarily in the East Coast so far, where that's happening. And they've had a lot of success with that. I'm particularly interested in green infrastructure, and I've been able to take the opportunity to look a little more into that thanks to this project. Green infrastructure, again, it can be restoration or even establishment of wetlands and beaver dams, and just natural features where water can be stored long term and in times of drought. And it also does help with the flood issues that the the built dams were supposed to solve as well. These are relatively low-cost solutions when compared with building gray, concrete, or earthen infrastructure. Again, it's an investment in the natural settings, and it looks, it's much more aesthetically pleasing than looking at a big concrete structure. and it helps the native and even non-native species to restore their communities. It's much more sustainable and less disruptive to the supporting environmental community. And here are some sources that I drew upon. I encourage you to look a little more into it if it interests you, and feel free to ask questions. I hope this gave you a good overview. Thanks.